This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. This week, I think it mightn't hurt you to learn about some of the things that are behind making organizations and getting things together. I was at with Zoom, I was at a CCDC meeting, and one of the questions was there, how do we get all these related environmental groups together? And we may have come up with a technology that will do it, but invariably over 10 or so years, or many more than that, there's been difficulty in getting groups, even a few groups like 10 or 20 groups together. They all have often a central core that is similar, but they all have their own ways of doing things, and often it's by happenstance, and it's probably not any crime if you can't get together as a functional group. It's a little bit like herding cats or herding hogs, or getting people together with different ideologies. And our environment is a little bit like the climate change has so many variables in it that you really can't cover the lot. You do hope that the different agencies that are involved will facilitate those people getting together. Zoom does it fairly nicely in the era of the virus, but it's not easy. And you can bring a group of individuals together, whether they be apples and oranges and bananas. They have different interests and they coordinate perhaps, but it's very difficult to bring them together. So one of my concerns is that when we work with groups, often we hand over to other groups, some of which we've formed ourselves, some of which are our establishment, some of which do or don't exist and possibly won't exist. And we hope that getting together in one room and non-violent virus time is good. But that too can have its problems. You can have leadership there, and you can be in a small corner without much microphone, and you don't necessarily get the attention that you do get with Zoom. So Zoom is helpful, and it can be controlled. The administrator or the host has the ability to close you off or invite you in, and it's not as damning as that might sound. It can be very friendly, and people can raise up their voice and be heard. So don't give up on Zoom. Zoom has become a very popular way of communicating when we can't get together. It's good to get together. It's very difficult to have an orchestral concert without all the pieces of equipment together. So it brings us a wealth of information. It brings us some excitement. It gives us ideas, and it just is a wonderful experience. So don't deny both, but in virus time, we have to be reliant on Zoom. Uh, One of the problems we have is that people have to initiate things. It takes somewhat a little bit of talent and a little bit of goal to create organizations. You may be able to do it easily with two or three people in the basement, but it's it takes some get up and to go to the state to form a not-for-profit organization, and then accumulate people and have the organization do perhaps what you want it to do. Uh, we have some debate about this with the Grand Prairie Friends. It's done very well, but uh, behind the initiation of that board was at least 10 years of heavy duty work, which enabled us to bring that together. We didn't necessarily want to be on the board ourselves, so we didn't want to breathe down the neck, but uh, we encourage, and often we hand over resources that are leave us with a struggle with what is left. Uh, so we work with in the framework of the university in a loose manner. We worked within education, within life sciences, with agriculture, with a school science curriculum development unit, which develops small units that again go into a classroom so that it is the teacher brings the item and it's not someone brought in from outside as a guest. We are well aware that if we work with groups or people, we're in effect encouraging them, and it's very rewarding for us to see those organizations do well. Grand Prairie Friends has done very well and done the sort of thing we would like them to do. But behind creating that organization, there was a lot of background. And I think I want to give you some of that background so that you realize what you might have to do if you're creating an organization for your particular interest. One of the things that sparked me was that I came from Australia and found it difficult to find the local ecosystem, which I eventually found out was 94% of the county. And it was very rich soil, and it grew prairie, ground prairie. And there are several ground prairies in the U.S. There are places where prairie takes off and gives that name. It's kind of a French background name. And Champaign County was very swampy, and so you had to know that this was settled late, and so you start to find out something about the history and something about the nature. And we've talked about this many times. So you had early settlers that came with livestock. They could utilize the prairie, but found it difficult to calve their cattle early in the season so that they would drop calves and uh, be a resource far beyond the June, July peak of a native prairie. So the aim was to remove the prairie and plant pastures and harvest the cattle. And gradually that morphed into uh, row crops. But there was still some rambunctious areas that are on moraines that are a little too hard to plow for row crops, and if they are plowed, they're vulnerable to erosion. So what do we do when the only prairie left at the moment in small pieces is less than 0.01% of the prairie that was here in Illinois, two-thirds of the state. Yeah. So one of the things I got involved in was working as small units that you could put into a university class or a high school or grade school that would give people an awareness of the environment. This was before there was an Earth Day. This was before there was uh, a the establishment within universities of environmental studies units. Uh, so gradually, I worked my way around and developed a group of friends and relatives we called Natural Areas Instructional Development. So I was teaching as a grad student in botany, and that reminded me that here we had about 600 students that were not getting any field experience and I could do so. So I started to find where natural areas were, brownfield woods, about 50, 60 acres, uh, treeless woods, named after a prominent botanist, uh, about the same area. In between, there was a Phillips tract that came in later when Dr. Kennedy, who was in charge of the university's uh, graduate college committee on natural areas, and he and others were interested in combining brownfield woods and treeless woods. It didn't happen, but they did get enough of Phillips tract, which was farmland, where there was a walnut uh, farm cottage and farm buildings, and this could be a restoration site. Uh, Gradually uh, produced small items to work with classes, various levels. Sometimes I would be asked to be the devil's advocate, so I would come to a class and ask rude questions about the environment that were designed to stimulate some thought pattern in amongst the students. And uh, that gradually we got to be a service. We'd provide one slide to someone who wanted that topic, or we would provide a set of slides, or we'd come in as an invitee. Mostly we didn't do the invitee business because if you have a teacher, the strength of the teacher is what they do themselves. So you don't want to deny that. And but we were uh, uh, supported by a tribe of different departments working loosely, mainly with contingency money. Contingency money is where you do a job and the department or the park district or what have you has enough money to pay you more or less on a contract basis. And so we were dependent on that. And we could do some quite fun things. And we got to work with the Committee on Natural Areas, which owns University of Illinois. natural areas. And the natural areas are relatively big. You have a few local ones. There's Brownfield Woods, Treeless Woods, Phillips Track that are local. And then they added Busey Woods. But there are also woods way out in the boondocks. There's Punk's Grove, which is relatively close at Bloomington, but there are others dotted around the state. And they're usually large enough for a University of Illinois PhD to be able to do something with the study of those sites, or they can be maintained. There's some sort of fencing around them. If it's a small plot, say less than 15 acres, it might go to agencies like Parkland College or other units. You have to know that 75 years ago, we didn't have a forest preserve. We didn't have many of the organizations that we have today. Uh, the teaching aspects got to be where I managed to belong to botany as a teaching assistant, and I got to work with students that had come from high schools that were fairly advanced in environmental studies. Uh, and what was presented in beginning botany and zoology was sometimes repetitious. So they would join a bunch of people, more or less honest students, who would do independent studies. We also looked at the fact that uh, students did a course without any field trips. At that time, loco parentis was uh, a thing that frightened most universities. They're, in effect, a parent to the students that are here, and in a circumstance where a piece of wood may fall on someone, or someone may throw a stone, or uh, then the university becomes the parent and is responsible. Uh, that denied some of this. It also meant it was very hard to organize. You had to have buses if you had a large class. You had to have times for different students, different organizations, and you would have to have graduate assistants who could stand and relate to a certain uh, project or a task or a interest. And so you had to have lined up outside the botany department on Matthews Street, perhaps 6 or 8 buses, and everyone had to arrive on time, which doesn't always happen. Uh, then, when you go to the field, you need to have some exercises that would stimulate awareness. It's not just a trip through the woods. You first of all, you might collect leaf litter. So you would have to explain that the wood that you're visiting is lined up with stakes so that you know there's a central point and there's stakes east and west and north and south. And those stakes would give you a place because the plant that you may have observed and thought was interesting will die and you won't know how to find it. So this gives you the basis of research. If you're going to collect litter, you're going to collect litter in a pan of a certain size. If you're going to collect insects, you're going to have a net and you're going to do so many swipes and so many movements with your feet and in a random fashion so that you have some idea of the collection. You are going to have to note where there are old growth timbers and uh, edge timbers, which uh, different, and you have to know that the fire will take l- timbers back and advance a prairie, and if you don't fire, the forest will go into the prairie. So you need places where you can demonstrate this. So Busey woods and tree leaf woods are excellent at doing that. Uh, but you have to know how many species. Dr. Vargas in forestry had done work with students, and there were 13 major trees in brownfield woods. That's giving you an idea of the biodiversity. You had to know how that was impacted on by humans. There was a road that went through brownfield woods, and you can see it today. It's is a little bit of a it's a little bit rolling, so you can see actually where the landscape was drained, but you can see where the trees did not grow recently, and you can just get a rough idea of brownfield woods and the road. And interestingly, you probably need to know a little of the history of the area. Who else lives in around here? What is uh, the Phillips family has a nice collection of Indian arrowheads. So what does that mean? What are the ages? Where are the anthropologists? Uh, where were the schools? Treeley's Woods on Phillips Track next to Treeley's Woods, there was a slab school house, a one-room schoolhouse, uh, and there was a house that I've mentioned before was made mainly from uh, woods taken from this 10 square mile plot of woods, of which Brownfield, Phillips Track, and Treeley's part of it. And then you have to have the moraine, Yankee Ridge moraine came through and gave it some terrain, and you have to realize that the water accumulating behind that moraine after glaciation will allow the river, which is a continuation of the Boneyard Creek, through that moraine. And so there's some geology here. Uh, and how can you see it? And if it is morainic material, it is also cherished for road pack because it settles down on a road and makes it not so boggy as it was in early days. So there are borrow pits or pits where gravel was retained. And these days you have to wonder what went in after the borrow pit was finished. What is in there now? Uh, how does that relate to pollution and impurity of the water that goes down to the Salt Fork and into the Wabash and into the uh, Mississippi eventually? Uh, so, how do you uh, first of all acquire the information? You you go to the Isaac Walton League, you go to the Sierra Club, you go to Audubon, and you find people who are really dedicated to doing this sort of work, and you do a lot of listening, uh, and you know that there are people like Dr. Kendi who was in charge of the university's natural areas, but he was also a teacher in ornithology, and he would put together a state organization that was uh, has continued through. And so, if you go to some natural areas, you'll see a little cardinal there, and this is a state uh, owned and supervised cemetery, Prairie, or something like that. Uh, so you have symbology. You have artists come in here. I'm just reading a book now from uh, a lady in England who decided to put together she was an artist, and she put together the visual material that related to her general territory, and she pulled in poems uh, and her uh, imagery was really very nice. And she didn't ever publish it. In those days, women didn't get to publish. Sometimes they got to publish under a male name, and that's uh, again where sometimes the person who really did it needs to get some recognition there, because they have to be promoted and do things too. Uh, so gradually you accumulate that sort of information, and you start to relay it to people who come here from other places, overseas, or even locally. Not everyone knows locally what a prairie is. It's not awfully exciting. It's not a mountain. It's not a something that's outrageous. It's not as friendly as a tree, but it's the heritage. Uh, Gradually, the curriculum lab uh, looked at us to see how we might be able to improve a botany class and provide a field work for young folk who will eventually have a career and be teaching in high schools and other places where they need to have provide a field experience. And if they don't provide it here while they're at the university, then they don't have that background to do it elsewhere. Then there's a concern about uh, test and measurement. How do you uh, uh, test students who have been into the field? How do you test their excitement, their interest, their understanding, their uh, concern for overall ecology, the balance between uh, groups of trees that seem to bounce off of each other? How do you have a structure of the forest? And so we got to design some video equipment and tests that were more than just multiple choice. And there were opportunities for students to write their experience. Uh, Not so easy to uh, measure statistically, but it's a way of working with students so that they do appreciate what you do. Uh, Sometimes it's just the experience itself, and so that depends on the teacher. So uh, the sort of curriculum development we were running into extended to people who were doing PhDs that were interested in teaching rather than in researching. They're the sort of people who become uh, teachers at community colleges or other places where they're more applied. And so we had a foot in the door of suggesting staff people who might also be students themselves or higher degree students that would work with the Office of Instructional Resources. This office provided you with research for pictures. They would make pictures, make graphs, charts, lend you cameras, uh, but also be aware of the test and measurement, and also of how you got early projectors into classrooms, how you eventually would get computerized equipment into classrooms. Uh, they would maintain those sort of things. Uh, and in early times, you would have computers, but you didn't have the capacity to bring in a visual, so you would have to have a carousel alongside. And when you got to a certain point, you press the carousel, and up come an image. So uh, early Plato and early uh, work with computers running from Netscape to other programs that were at the time national. They were evolving, and gradually you were being able to do more work and more variable work. So that still is with us. I'm talking to you on a radio program, but we videotape it with Zoom as I'm doing at the moment, and then we put pictures into that program and make it a video program so that it can come up on public television twice a week, and then it is rendered to uh, YouTube so you can see it at any time. That's a tremendous advantage for uh, in the inclusion of visual as well as audio, especially if you're doing with birds. You need audio, and the radio allows you to do audio, but in order to do that, you have to have the type of microphone that might register the mouth parts of a caterpillar talking to it, eating. So as that caterpillar eats the leaf that you if it, even if it's a monarch and it's eating milkweed, then you hear it happening, you see it happening. And we're next door to WEF, which is the radio station, and we're doing things by remote. But it asks the question as to whether this building could not be an audio visual center. Then you have to know that that's complex. You have to have people who can use computers, use uh, video cameras, and have some inspiration to do things. We have people who these days work with us to do that. Dave Witzani is one of those people. Uh, so that was an experience working with natural history, curriculum lab, Office of Instructional Resources, and the life sciences, which are biology and zoology and geography and history. And we need the understanding of settlement. How can you bring people together when they come from so many different places with so many different backgrounds, and they all have their own food and their own dresses and their own uh, organizations, and uh, so if you go to Ivesdale, you're going to be very Irish. If you go to Paxton, you're going to be talking to the Swedes or the Norwegians. And if you go other places, it's very Germanic. And then in town, there will be black community people, but they're also out there in the field at Broadlands. Early free slaves were farmers. And so you accumulate this information. Places like Beckman allow you to bring those paradigms together. The engineer doesn't have to be knowing the biology and the rural sociology, but the engineer should know enough to be able to talk to the biologists, and vice versa. The biologists need to be able to understand an engineer and rectilinear space, and whereas biology space is not so rectilinear, it's more amorphous, and there's all sorts of things going on in there. Uh, so how do we get people together to just understand some field like tornadoes, where you have people who are professional people who handle tornadoes and watch storms in an extremely dangerous situation, but they get information, and then the information is an amorphous glop of numbers, but you get artists to put a color on each uh, variant, and there is the discovery that tornadoes have young ones, and uh, they might do a certain type of damage. So you now need to have some sort of facility where people from different departments can come together also in a unit that is a togetherness. Uh, we did that for a number of years, and we were in charge at some stage. There was intermanagement of the university's natural areas, and the person involved had retired, and I became a maintenance person, someone who would fix up the fences if the cattle from the next door neighbor got in there, or uh, then I just absorbed this sort of information. It's very hard to put it into a one category, but that was what Arnold Beckman was doing when he created the Beckman Center, was to bring people together where there are teams, and uh, perhaps educate them not only in having a team of their own, but finding out what sort of teams might be uh, wonderful to work with. And that's very variable again. Do you have an Italian on your team, or as someone who is uh, native, and a woman? And so, how do you just do this? It's a wonderful field. Uh, our contingency money started to run out. The state was not so uh, free with money, and it had curtailed some of the university's money. So contingency money, which department heads had the ability to say, well, yes, well, if you want to take uh, pictures of Allerton Park and promote the preservation of a railroad bed, will support you. And that sort of ran out. So we uh, had feet in the general community, whether it's park districts, forest reserves, or whatever. We had been teaching to some extent in recreation, outdoor education, and informal education, extension, and we had some experience and some awareness of support. So we sort of that time we had our foot in enough community things that we could go to the community, and so we moved from uh, the curriculum lab and the space that they had provided, which was very nice, and the administration that they'd helped, to uh, Market Street next door to WEF downtown. We didn't have a WEF there. These four buildings were empty, and the reason was partially was because we're very near to the News Gazette and publication, and the style of publication had gone from letterpress to offset press, and then computers were coming in, and so the Grubb family that owned 8 buildings here um, retired, and those buildings were available for rent. We rented for a while, and we actually had early office to be able to buy buildings here. Uh, we didn't necessarily do that, but we did do it later. Uh, and we thought that since we're in the a business district that was a little bit decrepit at the moment, and uh, Market Street was kind of a raunchy street near the railroad line. You could climb a public train and go to Chicago and shop down your uh, paycheck, and then come back and pick up your harness from the harness repair shop, and and your horses from a uh, uh, horse stables and go home. So we found it very interesting to be in downtown Champaign. And uh, there's another process that I want to mention here. Early on, we formed a group called the Natural Areas Instructional Development. And uh, that provided some of these services to uh, university staff and students. Uh, it happened that there was a growing environmental concern. Grants were coming in for, or possible grants were coming in for uh, research and teaching, but also for extension. So we looked like uh, extension. That's exactly what we were doing. It was either agricultural extension with agricultural communications, or the university extension that tends to run um, teaching, especially teaching for uh, independent courses that are not a part of the degree program. Uh, Now, when you go out, you belong to a different community. You belong to cities, park districts, transportation departments, railroads, and so different sort of different cat. But we'd been used to it because we were working with both. These outside groups provide you with often with the opportunity to teach. Teaching includes teaching informally. We observed that there was a empty site across from our place. It was occupied by two humongous signs, and they'd been taken down because they didn't meet Lady Bird Johnson's dictates for being so close to a federal highway, which is University Avenue. And so they were retired. They had a 10-year grace period. And that left a little plot, probably an eighth of an acre, uh, that had weeds on it. And we uh, negotiated and found out that we could grow a prairie there. We could grow a forest and an edge timber and a prairie. And that became a rather unique uh, retreat for an urban area. And it gave us the opportunity to talk about a few prairie plants that might stimulate people to go to a real prairie or uh, so that's a phone call coming in from one of our supporters, and it's it's interesting. We started to get involved with railroad lines, and so we had. Oh, before that, uh, the university was looking to expand. They created an environmental studies unit. It was Ben Ewing in charge, and it was loose in the sense that it took in people from secondments, more or less, from varying departments. But it was the initiation of environmental studies, and from that base, we were given a different title. It was, instead of being natural areas instructional development, it became educational resources in environmental science. That was a it was mirroring what we were doing, uh, and it also was gave us a broader base. It wasn't a very kind number in that name in the sense of people knowing how to refer to it. So educational resources in environmental science is a mouthful. Uh, But we had spin-offs, and one of those spin-offs was railroads. In the middle 80s, the railroads were starting to abandon, and uh, these little railroad lines that were servicing uh, elevators about 5 miles apart were uh, somewhat obsolete. The main lines were a useful railroad, but even they were uh, retreating. Double dual lines were becoming single lines, and so we created a Heartland Pathways to buy up old railroad lines. We weren't the only ones doing it. Others were finding out that uh, abandoned railroad beds could become biology or trails, or uh, they could even be re-railed if necessary. So there was this cooperation with the federal government that gave money for interim trail use. But then you have to figure out who at local level is going to work with this. It's uh, in one case we had decided that if we did the hack work with the Kickapoo Trail, for instance, uh, we would like to have a board which was broad based, and it would include farmers who often want that soil back. What's underneath the ballast for the railroad is raw virgin soil, and that you only have to remove the ballast and sell it for road pack, and you have good farmland. So farmers are in there. Uh, they have to realize that we're also concerned about genetics and the gene pool. So having a broad-based consortium was interest, but locally there were established groups that thought that they could do better with established organizations, and they had some contact with the state. Uh, it didn't exactly happen. It sort of uh, we were uh, uh, resumed in a way. Our idea, our intent was taken over, but it sat for 20 years, and then eventually it got into action, and now has become a Kickapoo Trail. So the difference is between having a new organization with a various board to an organization that is established and probably has a smaller board with uh, more directed intent. And that can be a difficulty if you're preserving houses or doing things that are a little bit outside of the, for instance, a historical organization or what have you. Then you have to have strong supporters to make that work. Uh, so at the moment, the Forest Preserve of Champaign County and the Vermilion County Conservation District are in charge of that 25-mile trail. And that's pretty traditional for this neck of the woods. The Kickapoo Trail is the first long trail that we have in east central Illinois. But there were others, and you can uh, chip off pieces and still be left with very productive areas that have very different opinions floating around them. Uh, One of those was 30 miles, so it's probably 56 miles between Paris, Arcola, and Decatur. Now, this was a Penn Central line that was abandoned, but one rail organization had decided to buy it and keep it. And uh, the rumor mill was that the established railroad lines didn't exactly want to see that line reactivated. So they made it very difficult for the Penn Central to work. In fact, they had a train on that line and it couldn't get access to another company, and sat with its engine running for quite some time before they sorted it out. And eventually, that line was abandoned. It was abandoned with a lot of intent. If you walked along it, there was prairie everywhere. It wasn't everywhere. It was sometimes the line had been encroached upon. Sometimes there were bridges. So one of the bridges at Lovington was absolutely beautiful. It was probably about a quarter mile long, a huge trestle, more or less, rather than a bridge, covering the Oco Valley. Uh, well, the Department of Conservation got involved, and you have to know that in Illinois, the Department of Conservation is a poor country cousin and it doesn't get a lot of funds. And they were slow to think about this, and they were often politicians would like to see active uh, recreational trail. So it became a recreational trail with a minor of uh, prairie preservation, whereas we would like to see the prairie of preservation as main. And one of the things I said, it went so slow in terms of acquiring the bed in its abandoned state that uh, 11 sites had been sold to farmers. So it wasn't going to be a trail easily. It was uh, going to have a lot of opposition from farmers who wanted a few more rows of corn and soybeans. And in the middle of it was an Amish territory, and there was some concern about the privacy of adjacency to Amish farmland. Uh, the Department of Transport, Department of Natural Resources, Department of Conservation at that time, uh, decided to stop not 56 miles, but 36 or something like that miles. At Oakwood, there was another railroad line, and getting across railroad lines with recreational trails is quite a challenge. So the 30 miles that was taken up was from Oakland to Hinesboro to Arcola to Arthur to Heavy City, I think it was, near to Decatur. Uh, but in the last governmental appointment, Mr. Rauner uh, went with the farmers, and that line has gone back to farming. And I'm rather sad about that because that was not only our ecology, but it was their ecology too. If they want the soil that's intact and natural, uh, then we've lost it. And at the CCDC meeting, there was a question: how long does it take to be a remnant prairie? And my answer was there: try 10,000 years. That's after glaciation retreated, the climate warmed up, and the glaciers removed themselves. So we have very little of that left. And if you want to have biochemicals in the future for medicine or for agriculture or for what have you, uh, we can't afford to get rid of that sort of material, that sort of ecology. Uh, so, uh, so warning you is that you have to care about these things or they will disappear. And we had another one that went from Rantoul uh, or Lafayette, Indiana, through to Bloomington. It was went through farmers, not through Dewey, Fisher, and across to Leroy. On the east direction, it ended up at Lafayette. or somewhere near there in Indiana. So then you have to, you can't get people to get out to these things. You have to have the visual material that we've been talking about in other programs. And so we did that, and you had to learn how to put information into those videos and to get them aired, and that's a whole talent. So working with rail trails had to be done when it was happening. It was happening in the 80s, mid 80s, and early 90s, and you had to be there and doing it. So opportunity is involved, and there's a lot of privacy. You don't know whether you can actually do this. People get afraid of the paperwork that's involved, and the rules of the game may not be known to you, but known to certain lawyers. But it costs money to do that, and so you have to have some get up and go to do that. And all of that is behind groups like the Grand Prairie Friends, where we formed them after having a conference for Prairie at Muhammad, and we had teaching at uh, Parkland College, and teaching within the university framework, outdoor education, and so we had a feet in enough areas that we could and support, so we could go forth and try these things. So we still have 33 miles of railroad bed, but we have uh, 2 miles of excellent prairie over the Sangaroo River on one of our three truss bridges. And we have a Kickapoo Trail that's working well, and we have the Grand Prairie Friends working down in Cole County mainly. But we would hope that they come back and look at trails like the one from Bloomington through to Mansfield, uh, where there's a lot of prairie that's remnant prairie uh, along the roadside, and the roads parallel the railroad. So there's a very great temptation to get the Department of Transportation to widen the 150. So we have to think about doing that. And uh, so that's a little bit of the tale about what is behind uh, groups that sometimes where you have to be kind of silent and you have to applaud the what is done, and you have to be satisfied that sometimes the easy picking parts, the low hanging fruit, might be the ones that are worked on, and we to get left with what we have, and that's the time when we need some support, and we need to know, people need to know that what we have had to do to get some of these things into action. So I'm watching the clock, and it's near to time. So I'm going to say, this is Dave Monk of Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. And be out there looking and seeing and watching the clouds and watching the birds and seeing how some animals come into town and are right here where they used to be. They adapt you. So thank you. Bye bye.